So here are the requirements. It's 5 to 7 minutes long, 6 sources, and they have to be scholarly sources. Only one can be internet-based. Do you know what I mean when I say a source is internet-based? What is that?
There's no academia or academic that wrote it.
Well, it could, but it could be academic. The problem, or the thing about internet-based, is that you could only find it online. So, like, if you go to, let's see how that does. The WashingtonPost.com. You could also go pick up a Washington Post. So that's not internet-based. If you could turn on CNN and watch it, then going to CNN.com is not internet-based. Anything that's .org, like it's an organization's website, .gov, that's a governmental website, is not internet-based because you could physically go to that organization and get that stuff. But if it's just a website, like yahoo.com, God forbid, that's just a website. You can't go to Yahoo and knock on the door and say, can I get this info? I suppose you could, but I think they'd ask you probably to leave, okay? So you can only have one internet base. 6 sources, half of them, the department wants them to be from this semester. I think that's mean. So I'll let you have them. 3 of them need to be from 2020, okay? But if you hit a snag, like if you decide to do a topic that's historical, or just you're desperate, you can't find everything enough from 2020, just talk to me about it. There's no departmental police that are going to be watching your speeches, and if you can't figure, just tell me. Just don't do it and then not acknowledge the fact that it was a problem. Okay. In the speech, you will have to orally cite your sources when you use evidence from the source. So when you first use a piece of evidence from the source, you have to orally cite it. And here's what that involves. You have to say the author, the author's credentials, the source, and the date. And that's a mouthful. So when I first say, according to Dr. Sally Brown, professor of law at Harvard, in the Harvard Law Review in June of 2020, blah, 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 blah. That's when I first talk about Sally Brown's findings. If I talk about her again, I can just say, Dr. Brown goes on to say. So you don't have to do this every time, but when you first introduce a source, you have to say that. And that tends to be the biggest challenge of the speech, is integrating that smoothly into the speech, because it's not natural. It was easy for you to talk about, your processes, because it was something you knew, and you didn't have to, cite anything. But this time you do. Your outline will include an APA reference page, which we're going to talk about today, and an in-text citations. How many of you have worked with APA before? Okay. How many of you have done in-text citations, MLA or APA, either one? Okay. So you know that's as you use information, you include a parenthetical reference to, in this case with APA, it's the author's last name, comma, year. MLA was author's last name and page number. So that's one of just the unique little differences between the two.
Year the text was written?
Yes. Yeah. Good question. So the outline is a little bit more involved as well. You can have 2 4x6 note cards. This says you have to have a presentational aid, but you don't because of the nature of the virtual sending me the speech. But you're welcome to. And a lot of you did a great job with presentational aids with your process speech too, and me being able to see them. That was really good. So those are the speech requirements. This is due on the 25th of October. That's a Sunday. So we've got some time here to develop it. But what you've got to come up with is what you want your topic to be, and that is due this week. There should be a thread on the discussion board for you to submit it just like you did your process speech. But I had a student in another class say it wasn't showing up. It showed up for me. So if it doesn't show up, just text it to me or email me. That's fine. But we're going to talk about in Chapter 11 the types of topics you might come up with. Okay? Any questions about that? We're going to talk about this every class period from now until you do the speech. But this is the bare bones of what the informative speech is. Okay, then let's look at Chapter 11. Informative speaking obviously is communicating information in a way that's meaningful to your audience. The way the audience will, something the audience will remember. And there are 3 types of informative speaking. Talking about these 3 types should help you come up with a topic, okay? The first is a speech of description. That is a speech describing the way something is, what something is. Think about it, if you want to put in your notes, concrete. The speeches of descriptions tend to be more about things. Your textbook describes some examples of describing safety features of a nuclear power plant, the effects of an earthquake, the buying habits of teens, aspects of a certain holiday, describing a person, aspects of a disease like chronic fatigue syndrome. That's describing what something is. A speech of explanation is more abstract. It is more about why something is so. So a theory, a policy, a religion, a principle, those are things that could be better speeches of explanation, like describing the principles of Christianity or Hinduism or Mormonism, talking about the theory of relativity, or the effect of a certain policy on a certain people, looking at why something has come to be, why it's so. And these kind of intertwine a little bit, they can. But if you can kind of get in your mind that the speech of description tends to be about a thing, speech of explanation is about more of a process or a policy or a theory. And then a speech of demonstration is something you've basically done. It's how to do something. So you can give an informative speech about anything as long as it's something that is researchable. And I've had speeches about everything from a certain war to the history of Disney movies to a certain celebrity, to different sports, the evolution of a sport. The key is, whatever it is, you can find scholarly research on it, and you can do it without telling me how you feel about it. That's what you can't do. And it's like this. If you were giving an informative speech on the Electoral College, that would be, here's how the Electoral College works, here's how it developed, here's how it's used, here are the effects of it. A persuasive speech would be, the Electoral College should be abolished, or shouldn't be abolished, or the Electoral College is good or bad. And that's the difference. One is telling me the way things should be, one is telling me the way things are. What we saw last night was the way things maybe should or should not be, rather than the way things are. This is your chance to inform us about something, and I would really encourage you to choose something you care about, because this is a lot of time and effort with informing us. Okay? So those are the 3 types of informative speaking. Now we're going to talk about the goals, and here's what you're going to find in this chapter, in chapter 11, and in chapter 2. A lot of these things tend to overlap, and you're going to be like, didn't we just talk about this? It sounds like the same thing, because it kind of is. But it's just categorized in different ways in your text. But it makes sense. So there are 5 goals of informative speaking. These are goals you will absolutely realize did not happen a lot last night, but that's because it wasn't informative. The first is that it's accurate. You're not lying to us. You're not skewing the information. You aren't telling us what you think. You're telling us what sources find. You look at the source of information. You realize whether or not it is one way too far right, one way too far left, if it's a biased source. Like if you're giving me a speech about the death penalty and you only quote me from prodeathpenalty.com, we probably have some issues. Your source is probably biased. Or some inmate on death row, probably not the best source. Now if you balance that with a source on the other side, that's fine. But you always want to look at the source of the information. And then also see if it's timely. If you're using a statistic from 20 years ago about something that's happening now, unless you're showing me a trend, it's probably not accurate. All right, goal 2. It's objective. You could easily, even informing us, if you only inform us about one side of things, that's still not being objective. Like, I don't know if you've ever been in trouble with your parents because you omitted some information. You didn't give them the full story. That's a problem, and that's not being objective. So you want to present all sides, take everything into account, and show trends. So you aren't just showing a snapshot, you're showing how things have evolved. Now, if you want to inform us about one side of things, like this is the perspective of pro-climate change citizens, and you're saying these are the trends, this is how the theories that people who believe in climate change have developed, and you're clear about that from the beginning, but you're still showing a balanced approach to that, you're being forthright with your audience about what you're informing us about. But if you just give an informative speech about climate change, you don't make that your clear objective, and you only tell us one side, then you're not being fair. So you want to do that. Okay, so we're accurate, we're objective, we're clear. That means that you define the terms that your audience needs to know. You don't use a bunch of jargon that they can't understand. Your message is organized. Remember we talked about things you look for in a good speech, and good organization is one of them. But when I think about this, I think about a guy a couple semesters ago who gave, he wrote code for O'Reilly, the O'Reilly Automotive. He was a little bit older, and that was his job. And so he gave us an informative speech about code writing. But he used all this terminology. I had no idea what he was talking about. I mean, that's not my wheelhouse anyway. But he tried, I think he tried, but he didn't make it clear. I wasn't sure what he was, I mean, when you say write code to me, you might as well be speaking Japanese anyway. But you've got to make it relatable to your audience. You've got to make it clear, okay? The fourth is that it's meaningful. And this, just like we talked about taking, your psychographic and demographic audience analysis into account, you want to make it relatable to the audience in front of you. And you don't want to overload them with information. Because then people shut down if it's just too much. So sometimes you have to pick and choose. You can't tell everything that you found. And sometimes you have to, pare back, just keep it objective as you do it. Okay, and number 5 is that it's memorable. Informative speeches do not have to be boring. You can still be funny. You can still have examples, anecdotes, and tell stories. But you just got to be careful that you keep it objective. And if you can, in some exciting way, physically involve your audience, that's great. I'm going to show you an example of a really good informative speech that does those things, but still stay mostly informative. In a couple weeks, I'll show you that. So informative speeches need to be accurate. What else? Objective. Clear. Meaningful. Memorable. All right. Very nice. Let's go to chapter 2. Okay. Talking about speaking and listening ethically may seem kind of like those two things don't seem to combine, but they really do. Ethics are rules to determine right from wrong, and every professional organization has its own set of ethics. I mean, there are general ideas of ethics that are, even then are debatable, but there's a code of ethics for medicine. You can lose your medical license. You can lose your teaching certificate. You can be disbarred if you break certain rules of ethics in different professional organizations. As speakers and as citizens, there are certain things that ethically you shouldn't do. That's why there are laws, That's why there are laws. That's why you don't commit murder, not just because it's wrong, it's also illegal, and it's illegal because it's immoral, it's unethical. You don't steal, you don't commit fraud, you don't mislead people. Those are all things that are punishable in the law, and they're also things that are unethical. But as a speaker, you've got to do those things too. You've got to be ethical as you speak. And so how do you do that? Well, you keep in mind what values are. And I think we all can agree that society doesn't have a set standard of values, that it is up for debate. It can be, people look at different values differently, but there are some things that ring true and kind of run through society. There's a social contract that's in place where the government upholds a certain set of values in theory, and we subscribe to their authority as a result. What kind of speech is not protected by the First Amendment?
It's hate speech, isn't it?
Hate speech, yeah. You can't incite hate. But other than that, I mean, you have to tolerate all kinds of speech that you don't agree with because we have freedom of speech.
The line's drawn of like inciting violence, isn't it?
Yes.
That's where you're.
Yes. And like what? That's why you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, because you're free to say it, but or you can't threaten, even pretending on an airplane. I mean, you can get into real trouble for things like that because it can create such chaos and violence and trouble. Okay. As speakers, you have credibility, or you want to have credibility. As people, hopefully, you want to have credibility. If you're credible, you're believable. You are trustworthy. And Aristotle coined this phrase about credibility as ethos. We're going to talk about ethos, pathos, and logos at length, especially as we get to persuasion. But ethos is the idea that you have credibility. And there are two kinds of credibility you want to establish as a speaker. One is intrinsic, and one is extrinsic. Intrinsic ethos is what you say in the speech. If you can think of that, that'll help you remember the difference. It's inside the speech. It's the support you give for your points. It's your organization. It's how well you present your arguments. If you cite your sources, that's intrinsic. That's inside the speech. Extrinsic ethos is what you look like on the outside, how it sounds. Do you appear credible? What kind of image do you project to your audience? And both of those things are important. I'd say from our discussion of the presidential debate last night, the extrinsic ethos was waning for both candidates because of their behavior. But even intrinsic ethos, what they said, well, when we talked about did they back up what they said, did they just make attacks on the other one? That was in peril as well. So intrinsic is what you say within the speech. Extrinsic is without, outside of it. Questions about that? Okay, so those are the two types of ethos. There are also two types of communication that go along with this. And they are monologic and dialogic. Think about it like this. Monologic is singular, it's one. Mono means one. It is selfish communication. It's if I have my best interest in mind and not yours as the audience. I try to use deception, dogma, distrust, I try to coerce. I don't have your best interest in mind. I get really defensive. I'm insincere. I want to exploit you. I appear superior to you. That's monologic. You think of any dictators in the past who have been monologic communicators. Kim Jong-un. Hitler. The idea that, he didn't have the best interest of all the German people in mind, did he? So monologic communication, and we see glimpses of this, I would imagine, in some of our politicians today and other leaders. Think about Bernie Madoff bilking billions of dollars out of his investors. He was singularly focused on his own empire. He was a monologic communicator. He was deceptive. Have any of you heard about Elizabeth Holmes? She was the inventor who was claiming you could prick a finger and then get all the lab results from the blood drop. Thanatos, I think, was the name of her company. And she lied and got all this investment and is now under criminal charges for fraud because she said, yeah, it'll work. And she was, we're going to put it in every Walgreens in America. And really, they had these machines in Walgreens, but they were shipping the blood elsewhere to test. And they said it could be tested right there. I mean, it was just one deception after the next. But then you've got dialogic communication, and that's for the good guys. Those are the ones who are trying to, they do have the best interests of their audience in mind. They have genuine concern for the welfare of their listeners. All right. So we want to be dialogic, obviously. There are 4 principles of ethical speech. These are things you can do to attain ethical speech. And the first is that your search is exhaustive. When you go to research, it's very tempting to see the first 6 results and go, I'll make those work, because then I'll be done. But it doesn't show that you put forth any kind of effort to really understand your topic. You could get to the bottom of things after like the 30th or 40th result, and you're like, hey, I never knew about this. So you want to make sure you're trying to find out what actually has been going on with your topic. That you don't just do it quickly. Justice is the idea that you, just like we talked about with the goals of informative speaking, you try to be fair in how you present things. You don't try to skew them. You have public motivation. That goes along with being dialogic. You're trying to provide information about something that's relevant to the public, that might be a public problem. So you want an exhaustive search. You want to present things in a just manner. You want to do things with the best interests of the public in mind. And the 4th is that you show respect for dissent. And I think this is really especially compelling if you do it when you're trying to be persuasive. If you can show sides and the opportunity for people to disagree with you. And if you're strong enough in what you've presented, that it will withstand dissent. And part of that is that you don't have a hidden agenda. You're not presenting some idea to friends and you own stock in that idea. So you have a hidden, you really want them to invest even though you're not sure it's that great of an idea, but you have a hidden interest in it. You want to make sure that you are open to the idea that there's opposition to you, but also that you're not trying to do something that's manipulative. And those are 2 different parts of respect for dissent. People can disagree, but also you aren't trying to sneak something in, deceive your audience. All right. So here are some things you want to avoid, and avoiding them will help you be more ethical. You want to not be confusing on purpose. That's purposeful ambiguity. Not to pick on Trump, but last night when he was asked, would you publicly condemn white supremacists? If you keep watching the clip, Trump was like, I don't know what you mean. What do you want me to call them? And Chris Wallace goes, I want you to call them white supremacists. But it's like he just kept trying, because that was another example of trying to avoid the question. And that purposeful ambiguity that we talked about earlier, both sides would avoid a direct answer to the question. And that was purposeful. They were being purposefully ambiguous. Rumors and innuendo, you know what rumors are, spreading things that might or might not be true. Innuendo is when you don't come right out and say something, but it's more like your tone, you're kind of inferring that something is true. Like, you know, I heard he hangs out at, but it's not necessarily something bad, but it's the way you say it. Here are things, and we'll spend, I think there's a whole chapter on these we'll still talk about. But you will have seen some of these last evening in the debate. One is fallacies, when you appeal to emotion to undermine logic. And when you do that, then the logic doesn't hold up, but you've got an emotional involvement there. Name calling, you are very familiar with, I'm certain. Linking a group or person with a negative symbol. Glittering generalities are when you, you know, you wave the flag, you talk about country and home and freedom, you know, especially in advertisements like for butter, like it's homey, or like the Hidden Valley Ranch, or, you know, the Liberty commercials where people are always standing in front of the Statue of Liberty. That's, you know, appealing to those kinds of values. You know, we want to make America great again. It's an appeal to values, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you don't back it up, then it can be problematic. If that's all you do is wave the flag and don't provide plans behind it. That's what you want to avoid. Testimonials can be really good, but they can also be manipulated. Using celebrities to endorse certain products or something, or certain ideas, and are doing it in a manipulative way. Plain folks is acting like, I'm one of you, I'm just like you, when, you know, maybe you're not. And then bandwagoning, of course, is saying everybody's doing it and getting people, trying to appeal that way, which is it can be very hard to stand up against. So you don't want to use fallacies, you don't want to spread rumors, use innuendo, use testimonials against people, create this false sense of trust and home and values. Plain folks and bandwagoning. Those are all pitfalls to avoid because they're manipulating your audience. Okay, this next part is talking a lot about research, and that's a lot of what we're going to talk about next week too. But these are ways to evaluate if information is real and if it's credible, so that you aren't accidentally using evidence that's bad evidence to support your claims. And if you go by this acronym PARTS, it'll help you remember it. So P is point of view. What is the point of view or bias of the organization? Like when I went this morning and looked up, I know the New York Times is going to be more left-leaning, so I looked for CNN or New York Times or MSNBC. I looked for one that tends to be associated with more to the left. And then I intentionally looked at Fox News because I wanted to see how the two compared. That's looking for point of view. And that's not to say that either of those news organizations is spreading falsehood, but it is acknowledging that there's a bias there. Authority is looking at the credentials of the author and the publisher, and I really encourage you, if you find an author, Google them and see who they are. Like, what are their credentials? Are they just a staff writer, or are they like a professor of psychology somewhere? Because if you can say that someone has better credentials, it makes your evidence that much stronger. So you look at the point of view, the authority of the source, and R, the reliability of the source. Is the information accurate? And what I would tell you is this: if you find a piece of information that you can only find one place, can't find it anywhere else, it's probably not true. It's probably too good to be true. My debaters would fall into this. They'd find this one great statistic, but they couldn't find it anyplace else. And you'd end up finding out it just wasn't reliable. It was a bad study, there's a bad source, there's some reason why it couldn't be believed. I mean, is it written by a meth head on a mountain with a laptop? Anybody can publish anything. You've got to get to the bottom of it. You can't just trust it anymore. And you really never could. It's just now it's so much easier to get published than it was when I was in college even. Things were still printed everywhere. There was no internet. And you had to go and physically look at the documents. And this is, everybody, it's all so accessible, you have to wade through a lot more. So PAR, point of view, authority, reliability. T, again, is timeliness, which we've already talked about. And scope is how hard did you look, which we also already talked about. And if you put those things together, you will be literate and ethical with the research that you found. Hopefully.